I'm not sure how many of you were here about 14 months ago. I gave a presentation on my last book, Financial Armageddon. As it turns out, for better or worse, it proved to be somewhat prescient in terms of what's happening with the U.S. economy, the unraveling that I expected would take place. Certainly I didn't see it as ferocious and as quickly as this, but I do think that much of this was predictable. And I come at that from the point of view of this book, which is my third book. Just a little background on me. I have 25 years on Wall Street. Don't hold it against me. I have always had an interest in writing. My first book was not in the least negative. It was an overview of the stock market. The second book, really, which was entitled Financial Armageddon, was a sort of follow-up to some of the trends I'd seen developing. And the idea is that there were many different obligations and many different excesses, and it was all going to come home to roost. So that's kind of the background that got me there. The background that got me here with this book is the notion that what does all this economic cancer, if you like, mean for the United States? What are the implications? And again, in a way, each book along the way, I've looked at it and extrapolated and tried to compare what happened in the past. And frankly, I didn't like what I saw. For one thing, if you look at history, for example, you notice there's something relatively recurring, and that is the cycles of great powers. We've had Britain before us, we had Rome in the past, we had Spain, we had a number of other countries who've transitioned from being world leaders to also-rans. So that was part of the background. Also part of the background was my experience in markets and the way that different financial and economic systems interact. And quite frankly, that also plays a role in the book, is that everything that sort of got us to this point, in my view, is going away. So that's a little bit of background about where I'm starting from. There is a little bit of material that I brought notes for, which gives you some better clarity on what's happening. But I think the thing you have to remember about this is, although it's ostensibly an economics book, it's ostensibly a financial book, my last book and this book both incorporate the social side of things because they matter. I mean, one of the points that came back to me before was the fact that a lot of these books don't talk about the reality of rising unemployment. They don't talk about the reality of failing institutions. They don't talk about the reality of falling markets. And the truth is that those affect people, and at the same time, people react, and it produces other reactions. One of the things, for example, I talked about in my second book was this notion that we were going to see more crime. Now, that's not typical in a financial book. But over time, my reckoning was that on the one hand, the economic times would become more difficult, which means certain people would be more opportunistic about committing criminal acts. But on the other hand, and we're already seeing it to a certain extent, there'd be cutback in budgets, both at the sort of local level and the state level and the federal level for policing and security. Businesses would cut back in terms of the kinds of things, in-store security, personnel on the shop floor, for example. So all these things added up. And I guess my point is that it's never just about money. It's about the whole picture, at least from my perspective. So it kind of gives you the background that although they shoved me in the business and economics section, I always think it's important to put it into a broader perspective. And frankly, what I've written about actually is going to talk about a number of aspects in terms of people's personal lives, in terms of people's investments, and in terms of people's ability to make a living, which is what I cover in the book. And all of those things are very relevant, obviously, whether you have investments or not. The other factors matter a lot. So let me get started. Again, the point I want to make here is it's going to affect businesses as well as people who work. It's going to affect finances, where you keep your money, how you keep your money, in fact. And it's also going to have an impact on the way you live and where you live. Now, I cover a number of topics in the book. I've pulled out three of them in particular And the first, in my mind, is the most important, and that relates to the cover of the book, the title of the book, which is When Giants Fall. And the idea in this case is the giant is the U.S. I'm making the argument for a number of reasons that I get into that the U.S. role is changing, and with that changing role, it's going to have a tremendous impact on our relationship with the rest of the world, as well as the entire sort of global order, so to speak. But that's not the only aspect. I mean, there are very much other issues that are involved. Again, I'll cover those, but again, this is a sampling. First, descent into disorder. My view and the role model for the way I looked at this book was that the U.S., because of the U.S. and because of its economic strength, especially certainly in the post-war period, has been the dominant power. It's provided a couple of things. First of all, it's been the global policeman. It's been the sort of judge and jury of last resort for capitalism. I suppose that's maybe one way of putting it. And they've also maintained an economic system that has been to the advantage of most of the world. To top it off, they also have had one of the largest markets in the world, at least up until recent events. And all of that has actually been good for everyone else. Economists call it public goods, where something that one person does is to the benefit of all. And in my view, the period that we've had since the war is an unparalleled era of peace and prosperity, in large measure because of U.S. dominance in terms of the entire globe. So if you put it in that perspective and you think about, okay, if the U.S. dominance is going to change, then it presumably has implications, and that's where I'm coming from. There's a couple of things I want to sort of point out here, examples of what leads me to believe that the timing may be good or bad, depending on your perspective. Good, I guess, from my book, but bad from the point of view of the world. I think the thing you have to remember here is that up till now, the U.S. has been included, generally speaking, in most things that have gone around the world. I mean, clearly that's been deteriorating over the past two administrations in particular. But just to give you an example, in early 2007, Russia, China, and India got together for a meeting to decide about organizing a more multipolar world. Now, people use this term unipolar for a world where there's one pole, i.e. the United States. Well, the idea is that other people are starting to plan ahead and starting to act in a way that they see things changing. And so that is part of the sort of background here. There's a mindset that expects change, and I think that mindset is permeating different areas of life. President Putin, who is certainly no friend of the United States, at least in certain respects, has argued, and you would think that he might be a little bit wary to sort of speak the truth, that the U.S. has overstepped its bounds in every way. Again, in some respects, no fear of recrimination. I think that would have been more difficult for the Russians, or anyone else for that matter, to expound that message in a forceful way as he has. We've also had, I think, a perfect example of the shifting status of the U.S. In terms of last August. If some of you are familiar with what happened in Georgia, the Russians essentially invaded the breakaway province of South Ossetia. There was a dispute there between them and the U.S. ally, which is Georgia. And ultimately, there were many in the room, or many in the area, who expected the U.S. to step in and defend its ally. And what happened, in fact, is Russia walked in, did what they had to do, and walked out. And there was no real challenge except talk. I think if you look at that from the point of view of where the U.S. stands these days, it suggests that something's wrong. There's people willing to sort of challenge the giant. That's sort of the background. Latin America, always been America's backyard. Just recently, they had a Latin American summit, which included most nations in the region, as well as Cuba. And it was a historic event. It was the first time the Americans hadn't been included to such a gathering.